The city woke up slowly, as if lazily shaking off the silence of the night. The narrow streets, where even the wind sounded more muffled than usual, held their usual calm. But it was a deception. No one spoke aloud here, but tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Even the walls of the houses seemed to be imbued with a secret that no one wanted to reveal. On the doorstep of the old house sat she, a girl with a pale face, thin arms that clutched the rim of a wheelchair. Her name was Emily, and she was a silent witness to life in this town. Her days were monotonous. The morning light, the squeak of the wheels on the wooden floor, the soft rumbling of her cat curled up at her feet. The cat was her only friend. Her name was Luna, and she was always there, tucking her soft fur under Emily's fingers as if she understood how important it was. The people in town didn't make eye contact. They cast brief glances at the stroller and then looked away. But Emily was used to it. She knew it wasn't pity in their gazes, but contempt. Different, they whispered behind her back. They saw her wheelchair as a weakness, but not her. Every morning, Emily rode her old stroller out to the park, a dilapidated and half-abandoned place where the children no longer played. Luna trudged along beside her, making a melodious purr. It was her only window into a world that considered her a stranger. Something was wrong this day. The wind seemed too harsh and the silence too oppressive. Even Luna, normally a carefree frolic, was wary, her ears twitching with tension. Emily felt it. A faint chill ran down her spine. She stopped the stroller at an old bench, her hands resting on the wheels for a moment. Footsteps came from far away, muffled, heavy, as if someone were stomping to be noticed. Emily looked that way, but the path was empty. Luna hissed, her fur standing up. It wasn't just a wind, it was a premonition. The city held its own secret. Something was ripening beneath that surface, and Emily was a part of it, even if she didn't realize it yet. But that day, her life would change forever. She just didn't know the storm was already here. Emily took the same route home as always. The path through the park led to a narrow street she hated. There, the shadows of the houses seemed to thicken, and the stares of the rare passers-by seemed icy. She tried to get through this part of the road faster, her hands spinning the wheels of the wheelchair with force, the creak of the wheelchair echoing in the silence. Luna ran beside her, wary of every rustle. It was here, at the boarded-up window of the old store, that she'd first met him. Tall, with a hard stare that sent chills down her spine. Policeman Jackson was known around town for his antics. He was known as the cleaner. He found those who were different and took his anger out on them. "Hey!" A loud voice pierced the silence. Emily froze, hands trembling on her wheels. He stepped out of the shadows, his heavy boots thudding on the sidewalk. "Where are you going in such a hurry, huh?" She didn't answer, feeling her heart pounding frantically. Luna pressed herself against the legs of the stroller, making a low hissing sound. "Are you deaf? Or do you think you can do anything in your wheelchair?" His voice was soaked with venom. Emily struggled to look up, her fingers clutching the rim of the stroller until it hurt. "I'm just coming home," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Going back home?" He grinned, stepping closer. "You know, I don't even want to feel sorry for people like you. You can't do anything on your own, and yet you crawl around like you mean something." Emily wanted to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. Luna lifted up on her paws, hissing louder. "Shut your cat up!" he shouted sharply, swinging his leg. Before Emily could do anything, the blow struck Luna squarely. The cat's body flew aside and fell to the sidewalk with a thud. "No!" Her voice trailed off into a scream. She reached for Luna, but Jackson stepped closer, grabbing her wheelchair by the armrest. "You think I'm going to end it there?" His eyes glittered with anger. "Stop complaining about your life when you're nothing." Emily felt her stroller shake violently as he shoved her backward. She kept her balance, but she couldn't hold back the tears. "Get off my street before I make it worse," he hissed, turning away. He left as suddenly as he had appeared. Emily was left alone. Her hands shook as she cranked the wheels of the wheelchair to reach the motionless Luna. The cat was warm, but no longer showing signs of life. Tears covered my eyes, but something else was brewing inside. Anger. This day wasn't supposed to be like this. This town had no right to take away the last thing she cared about. She looked up, full of pain and rage, to where the figure of the policeman had disappeared. It was only the first act. Silence could no longer be a weapon, and she knew her father would make sure the world heard. The day dragged on endlessly, as if the city were deliberately holding Emily in its grip. She tried to forget the morning meeting, but the memory of Jackson's hard blow to her Luna, her only friend, tore at her heart. The wheelchair creaked as she made her way down the deserted street, trying to get home. Her eyes were red with tears and her fingers trembled on the rims of the wheels. She was almost there when she heard familiar footsteps, heavy and echoing. Her heart froze. "Are you here again?" Jackson's loud voice sounded behind her. Emily stopped the stroller, afraid to turn around. He approached quickly, and his shadow fell over her like a slab of concrete. "You think you can just walk away? After your ugly cat hissed at me?" His voice was filled with anger. "Please, leave me alone," she whispered, gripping the wheels of her wheelchair tighter. But Jackson was adamant. He stepped around her, stood directly in front of the stroller, and looked down at her contemptuously. "In peace? People like you belong in the basement. You'll only survive if someone feeds you out of pity. A pathetic, useless wheelchair, and you're a good combination." Emily tried to turn the stroller around, but he grabbed her by the armrest. His rough fingers dug into the metal. "Didn't you hear me? I'm talking to you." He reached out and snatched her phone from her lap. "Give it back," she shouted, reaching for it, but Jackson was already clutching the device in his hands. "Oh, that's your connection to the world? That's funny. Let's see what you got here." He tapped the screen and then, grinning, threw the phone to the sidewalk. The device shattered into pieces. "No!" Emily screamed, tears spurting from her eyes. Her hands shook on the wheels of the wheelchair. Jackson leaned closer, his face contorted with hatred. "You're nothing. Everyone who's like you is a liability. This town would be better off without the likes of you and your damn family." His words were like knives. She tried to push back, but the stroller wouldn't move. He held her tight. "You think I'm afraid of you? You can't even stand up for yourself." His voice was getting louder and louder. "You know, people like you could just leave them here and no one would even notice." At that moment, something changed. Emily looked up, her gaze full of pain, but also of determination. "You don't know who you're messing with," she whispered, and her words sounded like a promise. Jackson grinned, but for a moment his gaze wavered. He pushed the stroller, releasing it so sharply that it nearly flipped over. "Get out of my sight before I decide to make things worse," he threw, turned and walked away, leaving her in the middle of the street with a broken phone and a heart full of rage. Emily was alone. She looked again at the shattered phone and the empty street. Pain was replaced by anger. She knew this wasn't the end. Something was brewing. Her wheelchair was no longer her limitation. It was becoming a symbol that she would have to prove to everyone who she was. A thunderstorm was coming, and its first boom was this day. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving the street, Jackson, and the cold air outside. Inside, the silence was almost deafening. Emily slowly made her way into the living room in her wheelchair, her arms falling helplessly on the armrests. She stared at the empty corner where Luna usually lay and felt the tears come in floods again. The stroller stopped, wheels frozen on the old carpet. She couldn't move anymore. The phone was broken, Luna was dead, and she felt like she was trapped. She wrapped her arms around her shoulders as if trying to keep from falling with the weight of the world bearing down on her. "Why me?" she thought. "Why does everyone think it's okay to do this to me just because I'm in a wheelchair?" Her father was far away, and even if he was around, what could he do? The town wasn't on her side. These people never spoke directly, but their looks, the whispers behind her back, and most of all, their silence, said it all. When she needed help, no one reached out a hand. Her body trembled with fear. What if Jackson came again? What if he found another way to hurt? Emily looked down at her hands. Her skin was white, thin, but it still burned with the marks from the way she'd tried to keep her balance when he'd pushed her wheelchair. She knew his hatred was more than just anger at her. It was something dark that had been growing in this town for years, and now it was growing. Cops like Jackson were just the embodiment of it. But along with the pain came another feeling. It was rising from within, like a fire that no one could put out. She stared at the shards of her phone and felt the anger replace the fear. Emily picked up a shard of glass, holding it in her hand. She didn't know what to do with it, but that sharp edge was a symbol of her broken life. It reminded her of how the world had treated her, as if her wheelchair made her less important, less worthy of respect. She remembered Jackson's words, "You're nothing." They echoed in her head, but they sounded different now. The words didn't hurt anymore, they made her furious. Emily wiped her face and got out of the stroller. No, she stayed in it, but inside herself she felt herself start to rise. She knew she was alone, that no one in this town would risk going up against Jackson or others like him. She looked out the window at the street where everything seemed so quiet, so normal. But she knew the truth. Fear, hatred, and injustice lurked behind that facade. And then she made a decision. She didn't know how to do it, but she would no longer be a victim. She would find a way to make herself heard. Her father, the FBI, or whoever it was her only chance. Emily looked around the room and stopped at the picture of her father on the shelf. She knew he could help. She knew she had a power that no one suspected. She didn't yet understand how to use it, but it was only a matter of time. The wheelchair creaked as she turned toward the door. This was her first step toward becoming someone who could change not only her life, but make this city tremble with her mistakes. In the dark apartment, Emily held an old photograph in her hands. It showed her father, in a strict suit, with a serious look in his eyes and a hand on her shoulder. She sat in her wheelchair, smiling as if this moment was the happiest of her life. She closed her eyes and felt the memories come flooding back. Her father, Mark Drake, had always been more than just a parent to her. His words, his confidence, his voice, all of it had been a shield to her from the world. But he'd left their small town long ago, gone for work, leaving her alone with her mother, who soon couldn't take the pressure and disappeared as well. Emily knew her father worked for the FBI, but she'd never imagined the extent of his power. To her, he was just a man who called her his light, promising to return as soon as he could. But the years passed, and the promises remained words. She couldn't be angry with him. Every time they talked on the phone, she could hear the weariness in his voice, hear the weight of his work and the guilt weighing on him. He often asked about her wheelchair, about whether she was coping, and she always answered the same thing. "I'm fine, Daddy." But now she wasn't okay anymore. She picked up the cell phone Jackson had smashed this morning and looked at it. It was a gift from her father. She remembered him handing it to her himself, saying, "You can always call me wherever I am." Emily set the photo aside and picked up her laptop. Her father had once given her a special channel to contact him. He'd said that number should only be used as a last resort. Today was that very case. She entered the code and began typing. Her fingers trembled as she typed, "Daddy, I need help. Jackson, he killed Luna, smashed my phone, and humiliated me. I can't take it anymore. You have to come over. I know you're busy, but please, Dad." She pressed send and froze, waiting for a response. A few seconds that seemed like an eternity passed before the screen lit up. "I'm on my way. Are you safe?" Her heart clenched. Those words were like a lifeline. She wrote that she was home, but she didn't feel safe. A few hours later, a black car pulled up in front of her house. Mark got out. His suit was wrinkled and his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. He went straight into the house and hugged her without saying a word. "What's wrong?" His voice was quiet but tense. Emily began to narrate, her voice shaking and her hands clutching the armrests of the wheelchair. She described how Jackson had humiliated her, how he had killed Luna and smashed her phone. Mark listened silently, his face growing harder and harder. When she finished, he looked at her with a determination that made her feel safe. "He'll answer for it," he said, rising. "You don't understand," she interrupted. "This town, it protects people like Jackson. People are afraid to talk." Mark leaned toward her, his eyes glittering with anger. "I've worked with worse people than this Jackson guy, and I've always found a way to deal with them." Emily watched as he picked up his phone and began to call. His voice changed. It was cold as steel. "This is Mark Drake. I want everything I have on Officer Jackson of Hillsborough Township. I want it now." It was the first time Emily had ever seen her father like this. She felt something change. Her wheelchair no longer felt like a cage. It was a symbol of what she had been through and what she would go through. She knew this was just the beginning. Mark was her last hope, and now that he was here, something had to change. But she also knew it was going to be a long fight. Her father was willing to go to any lengths to protect her. But could even he handle the darkness that enveloped this city? The next day, the town already knew. As if in this place, where every step was visible to the neighbors, such an event could remain a secret. But knowledge did not bring justice. It brought only tense whispers behind their backs and looks of fear and indifference. Emily sat at the window, watching the few passers-by hurrying across the street. Each of them caught a glimpse of her house, but none stopped. She knew. They knew. But no one dared to come, knock on the door, or simply ask how she was. Her wheelchair stood still. The wheels no longer squeaked. It was as if they were frozen in anticipation. Meanwhile, at the police station, Jackson was more confident than ever. His laughter, loud and sarcastic, echoed through the corridors. "This invalid in his wheelchair thinks he can make a difference. he said to his colleague, grinning. "Let him try. This city has always been on my side." "Are you sure?" the other officer asked uncertainly. "Her father. They say he's FBI." Jackson frowned but quickly regained his confidence. "So what? One man against the whole system? There's nothing he can do. The people here know their place. They'll never stand up to me." But he was wrong. The next morning, a succession of leaflets appeared in the city. They were found on doors, in mailboxes, even on trees in the park. They had a picture of Jackson, and underneath the picture was the text, "He killed. He humiliated. And he continues to live with impunity. When will you say enough?" These flyers caused an uproar. Some people whispered about what had happened, fearing that Jackson would find out about their conversation. Others defiantly ignored it, too dangerous to contact. But a few people began to ask questions. "She's in a wheelchair," said one woman in the store. "How could he do such a thing?" "It's just a rumor." The cashier dismissed it, afraid to say Jackson's name. Her father must have exaggerated. Emily saw the city stirring, but felt the movement like a crushing weight. She knew many would not side with her. They were afraid. They didn't want anything to change. Meanwhile, Mark was in his element. He was sitting at his desk, his laptop screen glowing with the dozens of files he'd managed to gather on Jackson. "He's got a long list," Mark said without looking up from the screen. "This isn't the first time he's overstepped his bounds. He intimidated people, hid evidence, and now this." Emily watched him from her wheelchair. Her heart clenched at the fact that it was necessary, that her father had to come and intervene. But she also knew she couldn't do it without him. "They won't do anything," she finally said. Mark pulled away from the screen and looked at her. "They will. They are afraid, but they only become afraid when they realize they could lose." At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Mark was wary, but Emily could see through the window. It was the older woman from next door. She stood hesitantly, as if hesitating whether she should do it. Mark opened the door. "I'm sorry," she began. I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry about what happened to your daughter." Emily watched as the woman nervously clenched her fingers, her voice trembling. We'd seen what he'd done before, but no one dared to speak up. But now, maybe something will change. Those words were the first sparks, but they didn't bring relief. They only showed how deeply rooted the fear was. Jackson, upon learning of the flyers, became enraged. "Who dares?" he bellowed at the station, his face turning red. "I'll find that bastard and he'll be sorry." But deep down, he knew it was Mark. And now his confidence was beginning to crack. He realized that this man wouldn't stop until he destroyed him. Emily watched the city move in its fear, and for the first time she felt that her wheelchair, her weakness, was not her end. It was the reason people began to whisper. She was a symbol that injustice could be seen. But a whisper is not thunder, and Emily knew that she and her father would have to raise that thunder to shatter the silence of the city forever. A black SUV pulled up in front of the house, its engine rumbling in a low, menacing bass. Mark Drake stepped out of the car, head held high, his face unmistakable. He was here to make a difference. He walked to the door, knocked, and Emily rolled her wheelchair toward him, opening the door. His stern gaze immediately softened upon seeing her. She looked tired, haggard, but there was a spark in her eyes that he knew all too well. He wrapped his arms around her, touching her shoulders gently, as if afraid of hurting her more. She was his daughter, his light, but now that light was obscured by a shadow of fear and humiliation. Mark knew he couldn't let this go on. After Emily had told him everything in great detail, his face froze, his eyes sharpened, and his jaw clenched so tightly that veins showed on his cheekbones. He was silent for almost a minute, and that silence was louder than any words. Mark had always known there were places where justice rotted from the inside out, but now it was about his family. Mark sprang into action immediately. His methods were honed by his years in the FBI, and he knew how to use fear against those who sowed it. The first thing he did was send queries to databases Jackson had no idea about. Soon, his laptop was littered with documents, old reports, recorded complaints, records of trials that had been accidentally closed. In each of them, Jackson's name flashed like a warning sign. But it wasn't enough. Mark realized that the documents alone wouldn't cause a storm. He needed witnesses, people who'd been hurt by Jackson but were afraid to speak up. That was the hardest part. In a city where fear was part of everyday life, no one dared to challenge the system. He started small, with an elderly woman who had already come to their house. Mark went to her house, knocked on the door, and introduced himself. His presence was both intimidating and reassuring. She let him in, trembling, and told the story of how Jackson had threatened her son. Mark wrote down every word. His face remained calm, but rage boiled up inside him. Day after day, he collected evidence, talked to people, and each new story was darker than the last. Children he insulted for their skin color. Men he beat up, claiming they were not from this neighborhood. Women who preferred to keep quiet so they wouldn't become the next victims. Jackson was the epitome of power that knows no boundaries, and everyone feared him as much as they feared the system that allowed him to thrive. Emily watched her father's actions from her wheelchair. She saw him leave early in the morning and return late at night with a laptop full of new evidence. But she also saw him talking to her every night, trying to convince her that she would never be alone again. She believed him, but fear still lived in her heart. Meanwhile, Jackson sensed a storm was coming. He noticed how some people were beginning to avoid him. He saw how they began to look at him differently, no longer with blind respect but with a slight shadow of doubt. It made him angry, and he began to act more aggressively. One evening, he broke into the home of one of his old clients, a man who had once filed a complaint against him. He shouted, threatened, and then walked out, slamming the door. The whole town knew about it the next day, but no one did anything about it. It was a show of force, and Jackson was confident that his power remained unshaken. What he didn't know was that his actions were only adding fuel to the fire Mark was fanning. Each new threat, each new humiliation became part of the big picture Mark was assembling, and soon that picture was going to become a weapon that Jackson wouldn't be able to defend himself against. That all changed when Mark came across one tape. It was a surveillance video that no one had bothered to delete. It showed Jackson behaving as he usually did, with hatred, cruelty, and contempt. But this time there was a clue, something that could be the beginning of the end. Mark knew time was running out. He called out to Emily and sat down across from her. She was sitting in her wheelchair, her eyes full of anticipation. "It's going to be difficult," he said, "but I won't back down. They thought your wheelchair was a weakness, but what they don't realize is that it's a symbol of how strong you are." Emily looked at him and smiled for the first time in days. She knew her father would do anything to protect her, and now they stood together on the threshold of a battle that would change their lives forever. Mark Drake sat in the living room with his laptop open, the light of the screen reflecting on his face. In his hands, he held a folder filled with documents that should have been classified but were now on his desk. Every new file, every name, every detail opened up a picture in front of him that he hadn't even expected to see. This town was more than just a small provincial place. It was a nest of rot disguised as peace and quiet. Emily watched him from her wheelchair, her heart clenched with foreboding. She could see how hard these days had been for him, but she was even more disturbed by what he'd learned. Mark closed the last page, exhaled, and looked up at her. "Emily." His voice sounded muffled, like he was speaking from the bottom of the abyss. "This town is a lot worse than I thought. Jackson isn't just an evil man. He's part of a system that was built so that people like him could exist and thrive." He stood up and paced the room, as if trying to control the anger that was about to erupt. Emily could see his shoulders tense and his jaw clenched. "Do you know what's going on here?" he continued. "This city has been steeped in corruption for decades. Police officers, mayors, even judges, they all work together to keep power. And all that power is built on humiliating and suppressing those who are different." Emily didn't avert her gaze, her hands trembling on the armrests of the wheelchair. "They consider people like me." She swallowed tears with difficulty. "A weakness, unnecessary ballast." "Exactly." Mark stopped and looked her in the eye. "To them, your wheelchair is a mark. It's a symbol that you can't protect yourself. They think they can do whatever they want to you, and no one will ever stop them." But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Mark began to recount what he had learned. The city budget had been squandered for years on closed projects that hid a network of underground schemes. Land fraud, smuggling, bribes. Jackson was one of the key figures in this network. He didn't just bully people, he used his badge to intimidate those who might interfere with these schemes, and if anyone dared to resist, they disappeared. "But why isn't anyone talking about it?" Emily's voice was full of despair. "Why don't they say anything?" Mark sat down next to her, putting his hand on her shoulder. "Because of fear. Because they've seen what happens to those who go against the system. This place isn't just a city, it's a prison for anyone not strong enough to escape." Her father's words were like knives tearing her from the inside out. Her gaze fell on the wheels of her wheelchair. She had always known that people only saw her as her disability, but now she realized that her weakness was an excuse for them. They looked at her and saw something that justified their own inaction. Mark continued to reveal details he had learned. Among the documents was evidence that Jackson had more than once covered up crimes involving his friends and co-workers. But the most shocking was that he had once been involved in the disappearance of a man who was trying to file a lawsuit against the city department. Mark realized that Jackson's case was only part of the big picture. To bring him down, the whole system had to be broken. But that was dangerous. Every step forward brought them closer to the moment when the city would turn against them. Emily knew her father was willing to take risks, but she also knew it would cost them a lot. She looked at his hands, strong and confident, and suddenly felt that her wheelchair, this symbol of her vulnerability, should be something else. Her father had fought for her, but she wanted to be a part of it too. She could no longer just sit and watch everything happen around her. "Daddy," she said quietly but firmly, "I want to help." He looked at her, his eyes full of doubt and pride at the same time. "You're already helping, Emily. You're stronger than you think." But something was building up inside her. It wasn't just anger. It was the realization that her fight for justice was not just her own. It was a fight for everyone this city had suppressed and destroyed. Her wheelchair was no longer her cage. It was a symbol that even those who were considered weak could become strong. The city had been hiding its secrets for decades, but now it was starting to crack. Mark knew the next step would be decisive, and this time he wasn't going to lose. Mark sat at his desk, surrounded by the pile of documents he'd collected over the past few days. Every word, every line in those papers was evidence of the rottenness of the system Jackson epitomized. Over his shoulders, Emily, in her wheelchair, watched him. Her face was calm, but her hands on the armrest clenched so tightly that her fingers turned white. She sensed something big was coming. Mark knew the only way to strike was to do it quickly and ruthlessly. He didn't just need to expose Jackson. He needed to show the entire town that their silence and fear had helped the monster grow. His method was simple: expose the truth and make those who were part of the system panic. He started with the sorest spot of all. He sent anonymous requests to various federal agencies, providing them with documents that proved corruption in the city's police department. But that was just the beginning. He knew that one paper could easily get lost. He needed chaos to get the truth out into the light. Mark found a way to use Jackson against his own system. He circulated copies of records that showed how Jackson covered up for his co-workers involved in crimes. These documents began to circulate among the people, and soon a wave of rumors swept the city. Emily watched with a growing sense of anxiety and hope. She saw her father acting like a predator, methodically breaking down the webs that bound the corrupt police force together. But she also saw how Jackson was reacting to the threat. Jackson felt like his world was falling apart. His friends and co-workers began to turn away from him for fear of being embroiled in scandal. His confidence was shaken, but not gone. He began to act more aggressively, hoping that strength and fear would help him maintain control. One evening, Mark came home later than usual. His face was tense and his gaze was focused. Emily was waiting for him at the window in her wheelchair. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice shaking. Mark sat down next to her, his hands resting on his knees. He was silent for a few seconds, and then he spoke. "Jackson knows we're going after him. He threatened one of the witnesses today. If we don't get there in time, he'll do whatever it takes to destroy the evidence." Those words gave Emily a cold shiver of fear. She knew what Jackson was capable of. She'd seen it firsthand. "Will you stop him?" she asked, her eyes burning with determination. "Yes," Mark replied, "but the question is how far I'm willing to go." He realized that he was now faced with a choice: justice or revenge. He wanted Jackson to answer for what he'd done, but his anger for his daughter, for the wheelchair he'd turned into a symbol of humiliation, was so strong that thoughts of revenge kept him going. The next day, Mark launched his final offensive. He called the federal prosecutors, gave them all the information he had gathered, and insisted that immediate action be initiated. But he also knew that Jackson would not give up without a fight. Meanwhile, Jackson decided to strike first. He showed up at Mark's house late at night, banging on the door so loudly that Emily in her wheelchair could barely keep from screaming. Mark opened the door, and their gazes met. "You think you can destroy me?" Jackson's voice was full of rage. "I know you're kind. Do you think the truth means anything in this town?" Mark didn't back down. His voice was firm. It's not about the truth. It's about you. You thought you could humiliate, kill, destroy lives and get away with it, but your time is up." Jackson leaned closer, his face only a few inches from Mark's. "Your daughter," he began, but before he could finish, Mark grabbed him sharply by the collar and pushed him against the wall. "One more word about my daughter and I will personally show you what justice means." The words, spoken with icy certainty, made Jackson freeze. He saw in Mark's eyes something he hadn't expected, a power that could destroy him. The next day, Jackson was arrested. Mark had gotten what he wanted. The truth came out. But it was only the first victory. The city was still full of fear, and the system was still fighting back. Emily watched it all from her wheelchair. Her face was calm, but a fire burned inside her. She knew their fight had just begun, and now she was ready to fight. Her wheelchair was no longer a symbol of weakness. It became a symbol of her strength. The city froze. It was as if the air had grown heavier, and every movement required effort. Jackson's arrest was a thunderclap to those who had been silent for years, who had closed their eyes, who had accepted fear as part of their lives. The streets were quiet, but in homes, behind closed doors, the whispers grew louder. People were discussing what had happened, but no one was in a hurry to take sides. Their hearts still belonged to the system that had ruled them for so long. Emily watched from her wheelchair, standing by the window. Her father was in a meeting with prosecutors, trying to keep the case quiet so that Jackson and those who supported him would finally be held accountable. But she felt the fight wasn't over. This town wasn't going to give up so easily. As Jackson was led out of the police station in handcuffs, his eyes met the crowd. There was no fear or shame in his eyes. He knew that even now he had supporters, those who believed he was cleansing the city of the unwanted. His face twisted in a wicked grin as he noticed some of the townspeople averted their gazes, afraid to look at him. But in the midst of this crowd was Emily. She sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the sidewalk, and her gaze was hard. She didn't take her eyes away. She looked directly at him, letting him see that he couldn't break her. He looked at her with contempt, as if trying to remind her that her wheelchair was her cage, her limitation. But she knew that wasn't true. She was a survivor, and that was more than he could say for himself. The trial began quickly, and soon horrifying details began to emerge. Witnesses began to speak, encouraged that Jackson could no longer threaten them. Stories of systematic racism, bullying, and corrupt deals filled the courtroom. Each day brought more and more evidence that this city lived in the fear it had created itself. But with each new story, tensions grew. There were those who didn't want the truth to come out. Threatening notes began to appear on Mark's doorstep. People who had previously remained silent now began accusing him of destroying the city. One letter read, "We see your daughter. We know where she goes." Emily held the letter in her hands, her fingers trembling, but her gaze remained steadfast. She knew that fear was their weapon of choice, but she wasn't going to be afraid anymore. Mark stepped up his security measures. He no longer let Emily go alone, even if she was in the park, where they sometimes went out for fresh air. But despite all this, he knew that he and his daughter had become targets. The system he was trying to destroy was fighting back as hard as it could. The decisive day had come. In court, Mark presented all the evidence he had collected, witnesses testified, and even federal prosecutors recognized that the case against Jackson was a symbol of the whole rotten system. When the judge handed down the verdict, the hall exploded. Jackson was found guilty on all counts, but it wasn't the end. As he was led away, the town was left with a choice. To many, it seemed that their silence and fear had been shattered with Jackson, but others still clung to the old ways, blaming Mark and Emily for ruining the peace of their lives. One night, Mark's house caught fire. They managed to get out, but the fire destroyed everything. In that moment, Emily realized that there was a price to pay for every truth. She sat in her wheelchair on the side of the road, watching the flames devour her home. But there was peace inside her. She knew they had done the right thing. The city had changed. Some people began to talk, began to fight, but others continued to whisper their hatred for those who had broken their usual order. Emily and Mark left. They knew their presence here was no longer safe. Emily left the city in her wheelchair, watching the houses that had seemed so familiar but now seemed foreign. Her wheelchair creaked, but the sound no longer annoyed her. It was a reminder of her journey, of her strength. That day, she realized that the fight for justice never ends. She realized that her wheelchair was not a weakness, but a symbol that even the most vulnerable can become strong. The city might have tried to forget her, but she knew. Her story was the beginning of something bigger. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? Have you experienced injustice or feelings of helplessness? We really need to hear your opinions and your stories. We sincerely appreciate each of you and thank you for your support. If you like this story or it made you emotional, please subscribe to the channel and put a like. This helps us to keep sharing important and interesting stories with you. We wish you a good day and justice in your life. Thank you for being with us.